Welcome to another share of Pirkei Avot. We are motoring towards the end of the whole of the chapter, which is the whole of Pirkei Avot, Avot in general, and we'd like to dedicate this episode in memory of Levy ben Moshe Eser and Elishev ben Levy, as usual, but also additionally in memory of my father-in-law, whose yortzeit is coming up in a few days' time. His name was Yerachmiel Yaakov ben Avner. So I'm going to hand you over to Michael.
Thank you, Baba Mashiach. So in this, the 10th Mishna, which is the penultimate Mishna of Pirkei Avos, the Mishna we're about to study is without attribution, but let's start it straight away. So, Chamisha Kinyanim Kana HaKadosh Baruch Hu Ba'olamo. 5 possessions has HaKadosh Baruch Hu in His world. Ve'elu hein, and these are Torah Kinyan Echad, Torah 1 possession. Shemayim Va'aretz Kinyan Echad, heaven and earth 1 possession. Avraham Kinyan Echad, Abraham 1 possession. Yisrael Kinyan Echad, Israel, the people of Israel, 1 possession. Bet HaMikdash Kinyan Echad, and the sanctuary or Beis HaMikdash 1 possession. Torah Minayan Dichtiv. How do we know about this in the Torah? Hashem Kanani Reshit Darko. For it is written, the Lord made me His own, as the beginning His way. Kodem mipa'alav me'az, yet before His works of old.
That's from Mishle, by the way.
Mishle 8:22.
Correct, yeah.
Shomayim va'aretz minyan dichtiv. Minayin dichtiv. How do we know about this, about heaven and earth? Ko amar Hashem, for it is written, Hashemayim kis'i va'aretz hadom raglov. For it is written, thus says Hashem, the heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool. Ezer beit asher tivnu li v'ezer makom manuchati. Whatever house is it that you would build to me, and whatever place of my rest. Ve'omer, ma rabu ma'asecha Hashem, kulam b'chachma osita mela'ah ha'aretz kinyonecha. And it says, how manifold are thy works, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in wisdom hast thou made them all, the earth is full of your possessions, kinyonecha possessions. Avraham minayin, how do we know about Abraham? Dichtiv, as it is written, Vayavrachehu vayomar Baruch Avram le'el Elyon kone shamayim va'aretz, as it is written, and I quote this from I think Genesis 14:19, and he blessed him and said, blessed be Avram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And Yisrael Minayin Dichtiv, and about of the Bnei Yisrael, where do we know this from? As it is written, Ad Ya'avo Amcha Hashem, Ad Ya'avo Amzu Kanita, and I quote this from I think it's Exodus 15:16. Till thy people pass over, Lord, till this people pass over which thou hast made thine own. Ve'omer, and it is said, L'kdoshim asher ba'aretz heima ve'yadirei kol chavtzei bam. And as it is said, as for the holy people that are in the land, they are the noble ones, in whom is all my delight, as in God's delight. This is from King David's Tehillim 16:3. Beis HaMikdash Minayin Dichtiv. How do we know about this of the sanctuary? As it is written, Machon l'shivtecha pa'alta Hashem Mikdash Ad Hashem kononu yodecha. As this is from, I think, Shemot 15:17. The place for thy abode, which thou hast wrought, O God, the sanctuary, Lord, which thy hands have established. And furthermore, V'yavi'em el guvul kodsho har ze kanta yamino. And furthermore, from Bereshit chapter 1:31, he brought them to the region of his holiness, to that mountain which his right hand had made his own. So very interesting Mishnah. It seems that what is it saying is that there are 5 possessions that God made his own. But this would, at first sight, there would be a difficulty here. Surely the whole universe is HaKadosh Baruch Hu's, not just these 5 entities. As King David says, and I quote, "The earth is the Lord's and all that fills this, the world and those who dwell in it." And also the next verse says, "The earth is full of thy God's possessions," clearly referring to a multitude apart from these 5. Also, we read, and I quote, "The Lord will rejoice in his works, all his works," since it also says, "God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good." We learn this first of all in Psalms, the first quote, and the second one was Bereshit 1:31. So in what sense are the 5 entities in our Mishnah the particular possessions of Hashem? And why did he single them out to acquire and make especially his own? So I'd like to quote from the commentary of Abarbanel, Don Isaac Abarbanel, and he finds the answer in the Hebrew for possession, kinyan, and he sees in this term 3 connotations. The first one being, in its sense of purchasing or buying, kinyan signifies something an individual acquires through what he himself does. We see this when Avraham gave the owner of the field that he wanted to buy an agreed price. He agreed a price with him. It was now rendered to Abraham for a possession, and I quote it's the word used is mikna, the same root as kinyan. Also later it is described as the field that Abraham bought, kana. Again, these are from Genesis chapter 23:18 and 49:30. Similarly, many acts of purchase described in the Talmud take effect when the owner does a physical symbolic act. For example, he gives money, or he lifts up an object he is buying, or he leads away an animal he is acquiring. The seller gives him a part of his purchase to hold, etc. The second connotation that Don Abarbanel attributes to this kinyan verb, it denotes an abiding, permanent relationship between the acquisition and the one who makes it his. It doesn't become his possession lightly or haphazardly or temporarily. It becomes his thoroughly and permanently. And finally, the third connotation is the kinyan connotes something beloved and cherished by the one who makes it his. Originally, this is part of the word's usual meaning for purchase. As the Chachamim observe, anything bought will have a grace in the eyes of its new owner. By extension, it can denote any possession that is particularly valuable or cherished that the owner feels grateful for having. So with these 3 facets of meaning in mind, we can see why the text called 5 entities alone in the kinyanim of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And also why there's this, I think it's the second kinyan, he mentions the heaven and earth, but surely this is 2 possessions and not 1. And Don Isaac Abarbanel understands them to mean the primal matter that kind of primordial soup that existed in heaven and in kind of space, and everything in it, which took form during the 6 days of creation, brought into being ex nihilo, or entirely out of nothing. This primal matter or soup was certainly the direct kinyan, the indisputable possession of Hashem. As the raw material for all existence, it must have been highly valued as the kind of moulding material for what we see today. We also know that in science we're taught that matter and energy may be interchangeable but are indestructible. This is the principle of conservation of energy in the universe. So that whatever was created still exists today in exactly the same quantities, but just reformed.
King Solomon said something to that effect. He says, in Mishle, Ein Chadash Tachat Hashemesh. There's nothing new under the sun, which means that anything that you see now has and always was in existence since the 6 days of creation.
Yes.
So there's no new innovation.
Yeah.
It has a lot of impact.
Or material added.
Yeah,
it
nothing.
was as it was, and it will be as it is.
We humans can come and adapt and modify, but the base materials, there's no new. So it's just a matter of discovery. It's not a matter of creation as well. We don't create. We meddle and we discover, but we don't create. Okay.
Yeah. I quote the Midrash Shmuel. They understand the heavens and earth literally as HaKadosh Baruch Hu's possession as one entity. The verse quoted in proof says nothing about kinyan, but instead describes heaven as the Holy One's throne and the earth as his footstool. But as Midrash Shmuel notes, a throne is itself a supreme symbol of royalty. Therefore, heaven, with earth as its adjunct or footstool, is clearly an important kinyan of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, a cherished possession that is peculiarly his own, and that is everlasting. So, if heaven and earth are his cosmic throne and stool, what sense does it make for man to build a temple for him to abide in it? If we build a Beis HaMikdash in Yerushalayim, it was only because us humans were not ready to perceive his presence everywhere. But ultimately mankind must perceive the entire world as his sanctuary, so that wherever he is, man can exclaim with the same fervor as Yaakov, Manoah hamakom hazeh ein zeh kim beis Elokim zeh sha'ar hashamayim. That's from my Bar Mitzvah Sedra. It's how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. So, Torah, which is his first kinyan, why is it his first kinyan? Because its study brings man a clear knowledge of God's precepts and laws. So heaven and earth is second kinyan, because they can fill man with a reverence and awe and to worship and obey, and they provide the setting where man can work out through the Torah his salvation and redemption, to make the entire world a holy setting for his presence. And now let's talk a little bit about the sanctuary of Beis HaMikdash. So, speaking to the Bnei Yisrael in the wilderness, the Torah already refers repeatedly to, and I quote, the place which the Lord will choose. This is in Devarim chapter 12 verses 5 through 26. Nor did its holiness begin only later, when the Beis HaMikdash, or the sanctuary, was actually built. In the divine words of the prophet, a throne of glory, exalted from the beginning, is the place of our sanctuary. This is Yirmiyahu 17:12. The holiness of its site stems from time immemorial. When the altar for offerings was destined to stand, says the Midrash, Odom Harishon built an altar after he left Gan Eden and offered up sacrifices. And there Cain and Abel brought the offerings that is mentioned in the Torah. The floods destroyed the altar, but when Noah left the ark, he rebuilt it at the self-same spot to bring his sacrifices of thanksgiving. And to that site was where Avraham directed to build the altar anew and to bind Yitzchak upon it. Many years later, Isaac's son Jacob left home to travel alone to Haran, there to find a wife. On the way, he slept one night on the ground, and the place was the same. So he dreamt of a ladder going from earth to heaven, and in a state of awe, he realized that this, and I quote again, this is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. So, from the beginning of man's religious odyssey on earth, the place for the sanctuary was predetermined and it was unalterable. Before someone builds a house, the land for it must also be his. The sanctuary is a kinyan, a direct and special possession of Hashem. It stood on a site that he uniquely chose and hallowed from the beginning of time. But still, a difficulty remains. A kinyan, we have learned, is a permanent possession for all time. So how can this Beis HaMikdash be his kinyan if it only existed in two finite periods in our history? Twice it was built and twice destroyed. So how can this be a kinyan? But the answer lies within our religion. Just as the Torah existed in essence before the world came into being, so did the Beis HaMikdash, or the sanctuary. It existed before creation as a preordained part of God's plan and hopes for man. When Moshe spent 40 days on Har Sinai to learn the Torah, he saw the celestial sanctuary as a creation of fire, and from it he learned much about the Mishkan, or the tabernacle that his people in the wilderness were about to build. When Bnei Yisrael were worthy, they were privileged to build this sanctuary on earth, and to give it existence among us mortals. When we grew unworthy, the Beis HaMikdash on earth had to be destroyed. But as the Zohar beautifully puts it, in essence nothing was destroyed. The entity of holiness that the sanctuary brought into physical being was simply removed from human sight. When Yerushalayim will be re-established in all its sanctity, then the Beis HaMikdash must reappear exactly as before, for its spiritual nature lives unaltered in a realm beyond our knowing. I quote that from the Zohar, chapter 2, or Zohar 2, 240b. And to conclude, we might note that with the 5 kinyanim, there came into the world 3 basic principles on which the world stands, as we learned from Shimon HaTzadik's second Mishna of the first Perek, Torah, Avodah, and Gemilut Chasadim. We know that Torah is, of course, itself the first of the 5 kinyanim. The sanctuary was solely for Avodah, or divine worship, and Avraham was the epitome of loving kindness, the personification of Gemilut Chasadim, or acts of benevolence and favor. Thus, in his infinite wisdom and goodness, through his kinyanim, his permanent personal possessions, HaKadosh Baruch Hu has stocked the world with those entities which generate and develop the basic values on which the world stands. And that concludes Mishna 10 of the 6th Perek.
Very good. Thank you so much, Michael. Very interesting. So that concludes today's episode. Next time we convene, we'll be doing the last of all the Mishnayot in Pirkei Avot. We look forward to that day, and we're going to decide what we're going to do after that. But until then, we wish you a wonderful and blessed week.